That should be a little better. Okay, hi, welcome to our Chatbot workshop tonight. My name is Eric Roby. I'm Director of Product Management in the Oracle Chatbot group, and tonight I'm going to lead you through about a 2-hour workshop, maybe a little less, hour-and-a-half workshop on building chatbots. And no coding is required tonight. Maybe it'll be a disappointment for some, but relief for others. But there will be no coding tonight. And what you'll find is our platform is basically mostly proper sheet fill out. There's some scripting we do for dialogues, and I'll explain that when we get to that point. But for the most part, it's a pretty simple process. And what you'll find is that chatbot development, no matter which platform you end up going with or using, it follows much the same methodology. Let's get started with PowerPoints. Before I get started, I need to mention that all my slides are covered by this safe harbor statement. We're not intending to give any kind of commitment here publicly, and all these products here are stuff that may change in the future, as you can see in the safe harbor statement. Before we dive into the lab, I wanted to talk briefly about how chatbot platforms generally look. And if you look across all the platforms that are out there from the major vendors, you'll find that they roughly have this style of architecture. And what I've shown here is a person on the left-hand side who is trying to use the chatbot to order pizza. And what are the functional components in a chatbot that support that process and make it possible? And at the end of the day, chatbot platforms and chatbots in general have a common sort of purpose relative to, say, a mobile app or a web app, in the sense that they're a front end that allow you to interact with some computer system in a way that then allows that computer system to do something for you. The fundamental difference between chatbots and mobile apps as we know them today is that instead of entering known objects into fields like your name or your address or perhaps your Visa card number, you speak to it or text to it in natural language. We call these interactions, or the things that the user says, utterances. And so you're going to hear me use the word utterance quite often as I talk about this tonight. But an utterance is a statement that the user expresses to the bot, either through text or voice, that the bot then processes and tries to determine what the user wants to do, and then goes about trying to execute on behalf of the user. So if you look at this diagram, which I put into this slide here, normally I draw this on a whiteboard, but for the sake of this venue, I've tried to put this into PowerPoint. And starting from the left-hand side, if a user says, I want pizza, the first functional block that is involved in turning that into an actual pizza order is a front end that typically is one of the following. It's a messaging app, say Facebook Messenger or WeChat or Kik or a number of others that are popular out there. Or it could be a mobile app, either running on iOS or Android. It could be a web app. I think some of you may have seen that already. If you get onto a web page for maybe a vendor of a consumer service of some kind, and you get onto their service page, and immediately a little chat window pops up, and that person wants to interact with you. Sometimes those are real people, sometimes those are digital agents, and they're trying to start a conversation with you, most often to get some vital statistics about who you are, what your name is, especially if it's a service request, what your name is, maybe what the service ID or serial number or something, and then can help you along your way answering your question. Another form factor in terms of delivering access is through digital assistants like Alexa. I mean, we see Alexa as quite often in even television advertisements these days. And so I think every one of us is in one way or another probably had access to an Echo. I've gotten 2 free Echoes so far. I'm sure you guys have access to those as well. And then collaboration apps like Slack, Windows Teams, Skype for Business, and things like that. So there's lots of different front ends that you'll find for chatbots, and some of them are through audio, and some of them are through texting. When a user makes a statement like, I want a pizza, the first thing that happens is it gets processed by some kind of utterance processor. And the nature of these utterance processors can vary greatly from different kinds of platforms. In the case of Alexa, one of the key elements of it is turning that audio snippet into text that the text processor can then look at and decide what exactly the user is trying to get done. Other things that may happen is that you may have foreign language translation or language processing in general. In terms of preparing it for downstream processing, and in two processors that we have, the first one is an intent classifier. And so, for example, in a chatbot that may be for a particular kind of restaurant, one of the intents that, or one of the things that they want to decide is what is the intention of the order. Do I want to order pizza, or do I want to order pasta, or do I want to cancel an order? And so one of the first things that a chatbot often does is try to figure out from what the user says, what exactly do they want to have done. If it's perhaps a chatbot for banking services, it could be a test to decide, do I want to find out the amount of money I have in my savings account? Do I want to transfer some money? Do I want to make a bill payment? It could be a whole range of possible transaction types that we have in a banking chatbot, just like we have in banking mobile apps and banking web apps. And the purpose of the intent classifier is to really route the user down a particular dialogue path so that the bot kind of knows exactly what the user wants, and then will ask follow-on questions to get further information so that it can act on behalf of the request. As part of that, there's typically another thing called an entity processor. In fact, if you look at the development for Alexa, you'll see all this. And you're trying to build a skill bot for Alexa. These same terms are used: utterances, intents, and classification, entity processors, etc. So it's kind of common. And the purpose of the entity processor is to decide in the utterance what are the specifics of what the user wants. So, for example, as I've got lined out here, the user may actually want a specific kind of pizza, perhaps a large, thin crust pepperoni pizza. But if the user doesn't give all those specifics in their initial statement to the chatbot, it's got to ask some questions. And so what the utterance processor will do is then pass the state of the interaction to a dialogue processor. And that dialogue processor will say something like, sure, we can get you a pizza, but I need a bit more details from you about what kind of pizza you would actually like. And so I may ask the question of, would you like a large, medium, or small pizza? Or would you like thin crust, thick crust, or some other kind of crust? And then it may ask sort of an open-ended kind of question, what kind of toppings would you like? Pepperoni, pizza, and so forth. And so as you're designing chatbots, you're going to be, especially in the workshop tonight, you're going to be specifying training sets for classifying the different kinds of intents that your chatbot may need to serve. And you're going to be helping it figure out what kinds of specifics, entities, it needs to know in order to actually do something on behalf of the user. Given the fact that the session tonight is only an hour and a half or a couple hours, we're not going to go deeply into the dialogue development. But the way we do ours is it's script-based. We use a dialect of YAML, and we basically help the developer construct a state machine using kind of a set of Lego blocks, if you will, components that are used to assemble the dialogue processor. And it's pretty straightforward, as you'll see. And then along the way, once the chatbot figures out what kind of pizza it needs to order for you, it probably will need to talk to some kind of back-end order processing system. And so we have a framework. It's in JavaScript, and it uses RESTful interactions with other systems to actually submit an order. It could be a JSON payload, pretty straightforward. You may even have a SQL query in that, that then tells the back-end system to do some things on behalf of the user. Now, once that back-end interaction is complete, let's say it's successful, then the chatbot will come back to the dialogue processor, which would then perhaps give a response to the user, something like, hey, your pizza's been ordered, wait 10 minutes and then, or 15 minutes, and drive down to your local restaurant, or we'll have it on delivery, or something along those lines. So my point in all this is that in your workshop tonight, the goal of that is to help you get an understanding of the different component elements of a chatbot platform in the context of actually trying to build out a simple chatbot for yourself. And so we'll look at intent classifiers, we'll look at entity processors, we'll look at dialogue, and we'll do a little bit of work with back-end integration as part of this framework. So what you're going to find is as you do this, and we're all probably very inquisitive minds here, you're going to start to think about, well, what happens if the user says something that's not currently processed in the chatbot that I would think would be a normal occurrence. For example, during the midst of the interaction with the chatbot to specify the kind of pizza that you have, the chatbot might, or the user might say, hey, do you take Visa? We call these non sequiturs, and a more elegant or a more sophisticated kind of chatbot would be able to handle all kinds of possible utterances from the user, expected and unexpected, in a graceful way. And we call these happy and unhappy paths. And you hear this term happy path and unhappy path a lot as people discuss methodology around designing chatbots. And the important point is when you design a robust chatbot, it's not designing the happy path. That's simple and easy. The hard part is anticipating and accommodating as many unhappy paths as you can without making the chatbot overly complex. So you have this competing desire to have the chatbot be tight and elegant, at the same time robust and accommodating user experience. The last thing we want as chatbot developers is for our chatbot to be discarded by the bulk of the people who first start to use it as being unhelpful and not intelligent, and then never coming back to it. So in order to have that, you have to have a good first experience. In order to have a good first experience, you have to be able to handle unexpected interactions that you have with the chatbot. And that's a longer conversation in an hour and a half or 2 hours tonight, but it's an essential part of designing a robust chatbot. So before I go on any further, any questions on the architecture or sort of how these things lay out? Let's see if there's anybody online. So I'm going to read some of these questions, and I apologize to the in the room people here, but let me just answer some of these. Is there a link to the slides? There isn't right now, but I'll send them out. There's just only a couple of slides, so you don't have to worry about that. The question is, what languages are used in this system? If you're speaking about programming languages, the back end is done in JavaScript. We have a general RESTful API, so if you wanted to use another language, you could. If the question is about what spoken languages, human languages are used, the chatbot natively supports English with the use of translation services. We also support other languages, worldwide languages. We have a version that's coming out very shortly that supports Chinese. And then we have other plans down the road for other native languages. Other native languages support natively as well. Somebody says, what is a state machine? How many people here do not know what a state machine is? Okay. All right, so a state machine is basically a way of handling a procedure. Let's say you're cooking dinner. A state machine is a pre-programmed process that helps you decide what steps you do when you're following a recipe and you're making dinner. For example, one of the things that you do when you make dinner is to turn the oven on to 350 degrees. Another thing that you may need to be able to do is you assemble a marinade for the meat that you're cooking or the vegetables you're cooking. Another thing that you may need to do is cut up some vegetables or whatever it is that you're actually cooking and put them in the marinade. Each one of those steps could be considered a state. They're all conducted generally in a standard order, and that standard order is defined in a state machine. So for those of you that know what a state machine is, for those of you who do, I hope I gave it justice. Okay, and the question was about programming or scripting. Okay, so I think I addressed that as well. Okay, so that was sort of my brief introduction. And the good news about tonight's event here is that I'm not going to stand up here and put you to sleep for an hour and a half. You get to explore this chatbot on your own, and I'm going to tell you how to do it now. So for those of you in the room and don't have access to the internet, if you just bring up your internet Wi-Fi browser and select guest, and then you'll go into a page that is a welcome page, and at the top it says something about selecting conference access. It's a little hyperlink. You want to click on that. And then when you're done with that, you're going to enter in a guest access code. It's in the access code is indicated here, 308. Actually, I have it wrong. It's 308-309-07. Sorry about that, everybody. And if you have problems, just raise your hand. One of my manager, Joe, will come around and give you some assistance.
They're also presenting that help as well.
Okay.
Clarify that this white thing is white.
So for those of you in the room, the access ID and password is for our web chatbot service. It's not for the Wi-Fi access.
And also, I think maybe a few of you didn't yet pick up the slip on the way in. They're in the back table and also Don. So if you didn't have the slip, that has the URL.
So let me explain the slips, and I'll come to that in just a minute. To do the workshop, you have to download 2 sets of files, and that's accessed at the tutorial PDF. It's the second line here. It says access the data files in the tutorial PDF. I give you a bit.ly. It should be pretty easy to copy down. One of the files is a zip file, and it has a bunch of data files that you're going to use to help assemble the chatbot. And the other thing is a tutorial, basically a step-by-step instruction set on what to do to actually experience the chatbot and go through the different steps that you need to do to actually build something out. Okay, so that's for both the people in the room as well as people online. Now, to access our cloud instance, for the remote attendees, because we don't know who you are individually and we can't assign individual user IDs, please do the following. For those of you who are remote and have a last name starting in A through M, please use the first bit.ly address for our service. That's one instance. We've allocated 2 instances for tonight so that we don't overload the systems. I don't think we will, but just for safety's sake. For remote attendees whose last names start in N through Z, please use the second line, the second bit.ly URL, Oracle CBW5. So A through M is Oracle CBW4, last names ending in N through Z, CBW5. And this is for remote. For those of you in the room, hopefully all of you got one of these little slips of paper here. And on this slip of paper, if you haven't, raise your hand, we'll give you one, is a username that we want you to use, the password, and then the URL. So hopefully we've got you spread out across both these instances that you won't collide. For the remote attendees, please use the following user ID. It's a randomly selected one, user ID 29, and the password is indicated. It's the same for everybody in the room, okay? For local attendees, okay, so I got that. So please name your bots uniquely with your initials and an arbitrary number. It doesn't have the number of significant digits doesn't really matter, but I would just want to make sure that inadvertently two of you don't name the bot the exact same name and start colliding in terms of changes that you make. So just again, use the data files in the tutorial from the first PDF, ph-bot-labs. And then in terms of accessing the cloud instance, for those of you in the room, please use the slip of paper. For those of you who are remote, please use user 29 and then either CBW4 or CBW5, depending upon your last name. And it looks like people have been pasting these links into the chat session so that you can just use them. Any questions on the logistics here? Don? If you should not need a username for Wi-Fi access in the room. When you go to that page, at the top is a hyperlink that says for conference access. Click through that and you won't need your username. You just need to enter the code.
Yeah, so it's a conference ID.
It's a conference ID. Everybody who does not have Wi-Fi access in the room? Okay.
Yeah, so
okay. Do you are you on the guest network yet? Who is not on the guest network?
Yes.
Okay. You should be prompted with a challenge page that basically asks you for a user ID and a password. How many of you are on the guest network and don't have access to that challenge page? Okay. My suggestion is try a different browser, or maybe there's something else with your configuration that may not be working.
Yeah, I think on PC, sometimes you have to maybe navigate to a page before it'll prompt you to Mac. Typically, right? There you go, PC and Mac. And then once you get in and get the prompt, you want to click on the conference login. There's a link on top of the page called conference login. And then you can enter that code. Yeah. And anyone else? Okay. Hard to see, isn't it? It's very small. On top of it.
Now, how many people are actually looking at the service, the actual chatbot service, sees this picture in their browser? All right. The one thing we have not done well with our user interface is that we've given you a lot of marketing stuff right here. Totally not useful. In the upper left-hand corner, you see a tiny little hamburger menu. It's 3 lines right here. Click on that. And then click on development and then select bots. And that'll get you into the bot development tool. Okay. Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. It's the hamburger right here. See this little guy right here in the upper left-hand corner where my cursor is? Do you see this little hamburger guy right here? Okay, select that. Then click on development, the little down chevron next to development, and then select bots. And then you can click on the big green circle with the plus sign in the middle. You can select that, and then it'll give you a pop-up modal dialog for creating the bot, and then you can enter in its name. And as I said, you could just use your initials and a random number to name it. That way we make sure we don't have any collisions because you're all sharing the same instance. So one person says, I can't see your screen. Oh, that's interesting. I'm sorry, what was your question? This isn't the slide, this is the actual service.
Okay, and a quick question, who doesn't have a slip like this that has the URL? All right, we need one more. Where's Dawn? Oh, yes. I need one more. Okay. I need the font. Yeah, you have one? Or is that blank? Oh, the conference code. The conference code is, oh, Eric, I think we need to somehow make the conference code from that. Is it 308, 309?
It's 308, 309, 07.
308, 309, 07.
Let me just put up a little thing on the side here for that. Give me a second here.
Do you have the more slips? So who doesn't have a little slip yet? There you go.
So the guest access code is on my screen here at the bottom of the screen. You see guest access code 308, 309, 07. And that's to get onto the Wi-Fi here at Oracle in Santa Clara. What did I say? Oracle? Intel, Santa Clara. See, I've been brainwashed already. There you go.
The online people supporting.
Yeah, I'm doing that through a chat session. That's the best I can do right now.
So that's right there. So do you want to just do that and I'll handle people?
Is anybody here in the room having trouble getting to the session, or to the service, to the chatbot service? Still you? You're still trying to connect, okay.
Yeah, so you're in there already. Yeah, you're in there. So, yeah, you can just so basically once you're ready to start, for anyone creating just follow that. There's a URL for instructions. It's in that sheet. Oh yeah, so that's the instruction you want to follow. But once you're everyone's able to log in, just open up the PDF, and there's some lab files that you need to download, and then there's some instructions to follow to start getting and start development. So that will tell you how to create your own chatbot. Sorry. PDF is in the little sheet of paper. Right, Eric? The PDF link is on the sheet of paper.
It's on the sheet of paper.
Yes, it's on that. So the. Oh, there you go. Oh, is that? Anybody not have access? No, it's the problem is getting the PDF. Oh, the PDF is actually the PDF link is not on. It's not on the slip. That's okay.
PDF link.
It's not on the slip.
Hold on. Let me show that.
It's been a.
Give me a second here.
Just put it up on.
I'm going to put all this back up now that people have kind of moved forward here. Oops. There it is.
Okay. So I think maybe a few of you will gone through it and missed the beginning. There's a data file and tutorial PDF. That's the editor. That's where you need to download the instructions to run the lab, as well as some lab files to for some code and things like that.
So you have to open the PDF to get the instructions on how to build the chatbot. You will use the data files to build the chatbot.
Anyone, everyone is able to see a PDF now? Or?
Great.
So the PDF is in that Axure says the second bullet under what you need access to the data model. Go to that URL.
That's when we need.
Once you get the PDF files, it's literally step by step.
So.
Maybe Eric.
Can you show it?
Do you need the logistics?
No, the page where you get the
Right, interesting.
Does anybody not navigate over?
Yeah, it's problematic for me. So that kind of, yeah, it becomes complex. I think I'm going to just leave where I had it. Where's my arrow? Yeah. Give me a second here.
Oh, you need to. Oh, what are you trying to do?
I wanted to turn off mirroring displays. Yeah. I have no idea where it is. Is it down here? Yeah, I got it. There we go.
Large thing prospect. Sounds pretty good.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
So just do a quick check. So is everyone able to at least create the initial chatbot and start to enter intents? So there's a question on the chat, and probably everyone's interested. So for people who have to leave early, will we have access to these accounts tomorrow? I think
We'll leave it open for 24 hours.
that will leave open for hours today to finish the lab. We're going to finish today. is everyone pretty much working on entities, creating entities, Amex, all that? Okay.
They're shared names, though. So that's what makes it work. There was a great question online. And the question online was, as I'm coding up entities, and in the use case here, you're actually, can everybody hear me? Okay, so when you're coding up entities, in the example, it asks you to put in people names. Well, in a real world production bot, that'd be problematic because each user would want to have names that are relevant to themselves, right? And so if you hard-coded into a bot that you shared across a user community, you'd have a problem. We handle that differently. So the use case that we've given you is overly simplified to get you through a 1-hour workshop. Fact of the matter is that if you were actually to deploy this in production and you wanted to be able to recognize the names of people who are familiar and important to a particular user, we would dynamically load those into the bot from some back-end system and then do some sort of custom processing to handle those names as needed on a per user basis. In the case of tonight's workshop, we were hard coding them in to simplify the actual activity that you're working on here. Make sense? Okay. Yeah. Okay, another great question came up. So there's a guy online who says, what happens if in production you have an utterance where a critical entity is misspelled? So for example, back to the pizza example, you misspell pepperoni, you leave out a few P's, or you mistakenly make an E and A or something along those lines. So what happens, there's several ways to handle this in a well-built bot. The first way to handle it is you go through and ask the user once to specify the toppings. And if there's a misspelling, and you could prompt the user and say, did you mean pepperoni when you said this? Or here's a set of toppings, just select from these toppings because we didn't quite understand all of the ones that you had. Another way to handle that is use a spelling correction service. You could correct the misspelled word pepperoni into the correctly spelled word pepperoni. The challenge with that is that sometimes spelling services can actually give back the wrong answer. So then you're really in the weeds. Another way to handle that is, and this is coming up in the next version, which will be launched any day now, of our bot, where we'll allow up to 2 characters misspelled in a word and we'll still do the match. So there's a variety of different ways of handling that, and they can all be used in concert together to provide an adequate response for most users. But you may have circumstances where a misspelling comes in and the bot comes back and says, hey, I really don't know what you mean here. Can you please state this in a different way? There's another way to handle the unhappy path. So. One guy says, I got a call in the middle of it. Remind me at the very end that I do that. Yeah. I did. It wasn't me. Yeah, it maybe is. I'll still download it. Yeah.
The question is that we're going to get a transcript of the questions. Yeah.
I can provide it to the host here, and then they can send it all out to you. I don't have all your email addresses, unfortunately.
Yeah.
but we can get that to you.
Put this in the chat, and the authentic is talking.
Well, it's okay. Yeah, I'm doing both. I'm so used to answering back in kind, so when people use the chat, I just answer in kind.
All right, is everyone getting into dialogue flow now, or are people still stuck in entities? Yeah, so actually, Eric, why didn't you talk about the two training model where you should linguistic versus
Okay, so there was a question here in our main auditorium for those of you online about why we have two classifiers for intents. Each classifier uses a different algorithm and they have different advantages. The first classifier that's in the list is a linguistics-based classifier, so basically it does sentence matching. The second one is a machine learning-based classifier. The reason why we have two is that quite often we're finding with customers who want to build a chatbot, they don't have real-world ready training utterance data sets. They want to build a bot, they want to serve a particular community, but they have no prior experience serving that community with a conversational interface. They have no idea what people would say when they ask a question or make a request of the bot for a particular transaction. So they end up synthesizing themselves what they think a user might actually say. And that can have problems. It can introduce bias into the training set and make it not real world when in the first deployment. Now, the reason why we have two classifiers is to keep sometimes those synthetic training sets to a minimum, yet still be able to, for the most part, effectively classify what the user wants the bot to do for it, which intent it wants to serve. And so for the linguistics processor is really good for these cold start situations where you don't have a lot of training data. The problem with them is that they don't handle outliers very well. They tend to be very sort of specific. And so if you have an outlier, it will not attempt to classify it. It'll just say, I have no idea what you're talking about. The machine learning classifier requires a bit more data to be effective, but it is much more capable of handling unexpected utterances that are somewhat close, but not very close to the utterance training set. And so it's better for production in the sense that it requires more data to make it effective. At the same time, it's more resilient when it encounters an outlier utterance that is fairly different from the actual training set that we use to train in classification.
So since today we're just creating a bot and just getting started, we're using a linguistic model for initial development. If we're actually production, when you have more training sets, then that's when you start to use the machine learning.
What is that number?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
What do we consider sufficient?
For the machine learning, deep learning model, typically what we're seeing is somewhere between 10 to 20 utterances will get you pretty good classification. However, if your intents are closely aligned, and what I mean by closely aligned is that the training set for one utterance has a lot of similar words that you would find in a training set for another utterance or phrases, the bot's going to have trouble distinguishing one intent from another. And the more they're overlapping, the harder it's going to be. So what do you do in that circumstance? If you believe that the utterances that the real world users are going to use are going to be very close for one request versus another, you might consider combining those into one intent and then attempting to disambiguate what the user actually wants by saying, hey, I'm going to give you two links. Click on this link if you want to have to do this kind of interaction. Click on this other link if you want to do another kind of interaction. It adds a one more stage of interaction with the chatbot before it figures out what the user wants to do. But you have less of a risk of the user actually, or the bot misclassifying what the user wants and taking them down to, an unhappy path.
For example, all the data that is playing for the balances, it's all randomly selected numbers.
The actual data that's coming back is my checking account. No, I'm just kidding. it's sample database. It's not actually going to a backend.
It's actual, it's calling, I think, special total again, that component is calling a piece of node.
Yeah, so Joe's correct. What we've done is in the back end, when we're actually calling out into the custom components, we have a little JSON database, and then those are the numbers we're pulling out from the JSON database. If you were implementing into a real back end, you would actually have a full-on REST interface to the entry points for that back end, and whatever security overlay infrastructure you would need to access those on top. Whether you had credentials that the bot does on behalf of the user, or the user's passing his credentials all the way through to the back end. You could support either kinds of things, but that's how it would actually work.
So just want to do a quick check. Is anyone still on lab 2, which is enemy? Okay, so okay, and anyone on lab 3, which is dialogue? Okay, so anyone gone beyond that? Wow. Okay, so we have a few people on lab 4. Training and test your bot. Good job. So I know a few of you have gone moving further ahead, so that's a bit of an incentive. So I was told there are food and, afterwards, and we'll try to wrap up around 7:15, 7:20, so there's enough time for networking. So for those of you who are actually I finish early, that's correct. But we'll try to wrap up around 7:15.
How much time do we have left for these guys? Half an hour. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to send a note to everybody online.
So just a quick time check. How many have gone to customer enrollment? Yeah, 6. Yeah. How many, okay, so here we go.
Which would be awesome. Actually, it's hot swappable. Which is I think you change it. No, if you change the name of an entity that you create. Hold on, just give me a second. What was the question?
So, you know how you select a choice.
Yeah.
The first time or second time.
Right now, in the current Chatbot platform, if you make a selection of a list, drop-down list, and then you go back and select something different, you're going to confuse the bot. Because now you're in a state where it doesn't expect a second list selection. With the current way we've coded the dialogue, what you would end up having to do is to have a dialogue that is more resilient, so that when a second selection comes along and says, oh, but you've already selected this first thing, would you like to use the first one or the second one, and then proceed from there. This is back to my point earlier about handling unexpected paths. So going back and selecting something after you've already selected it might be considered, you know, something that was infrequent, but yet you do want to be able to handle that. And so in your dialogue design, you'd have to kind of accommodate that kind of thing. Absolutely is an obvious thing. It's handled, we don't handle it out of the box. We handle it because there's so many different variations of that kind of thing. We handle it by allowing you to be, having the flexibility of how you want to handle that with the way the dialogues are assembled. Great point, but there's so many different variations of that kind of unexpected activity. Yeah, see that? Okay, so the question is explaining state transitions. So as you are in the YAML right now, you'll note that the way we've used YAML is that we use it to express a series of components. Each component represents a state in a state machine. Each component has some options depending on the component type for how it guides the dialogue flow to a different bot, and those are defined in the transitions section of the state component definition. And some of those transitions are just simple. I'm going to go to the next transition defined in the script, and you'll see open curly bracket, close curly bracket. That's what that means. In other circumstances, like for early on in the chatbot, there's a component called system.intent. And in the transition section, there's a number of different actions they can take. You'll see the phrase transitions : and then indented actions : and then a series of possible next steps to take. For that particular component, those next steps are defined based on the intent classifier's result for the incoming utterance. If it classifies it as a balances utterance, it will transition to the next state for the balances reference. So I think in your sample bot it says balances : and then I think it says select balances or send balances or something along those lines. So it transitions to that next state component, which happens to be sequentially the next thing, but that's beside the point. It uses these internal logic to decide which next state to go to as defined in the actions section. Different components handle that idea of transitions differently because they have different purposes. For example, in our catalog, we have a component that basically does a switch statement based on the state of a variable. And each different possible switch option will allow it to transition to a named component. And based on the value of a particular variable, it then will transition to that state. Not all of them handle it exactly the same way. It depends upon the purpose of each component that's used in the dialog. Answer your question?
Yeah. So if the transition is empty, the next.
It defaults to the next state.
So I have a question of print balance. Transition balance is 0. Then
Yep. And what's your question about it?
the print balance.
Yeah, and what's your question?
The transition is 0.
I'm sorry. Oh, does it at the end? Does it say at the end of the print balance sequence? Does it say transition to print balance?
Yeah, it's a service has print balance.
Let me have a look. What's the name of your bot? What's the name of your chatbot? I'm going to go look at your bot and I'll tell you what it's doing. Oh, wait a minute. You're on, are you on 3 or 2? Is it this one? No. JR, you said? JL, okay. Oh, I don't see it. You're in 2, probably. Let me come down and take a look. Okay, so there's a question online for how do we configure the component services. And let me just bring that up so we can have a look at that. So for those of you who are on remote, if you can look at the Zoom here, you'll see in this folder that I've opened up called lab files, something called custom component URL _ copy.txt. And what we're doing here is we're giving you some information to load into the chatbot So let me just bring up my chatbot and I'll show you what it looks like. I hope I have one in here. No, I don't. So let's just make one. Okay. So basically, you're going to configure some component services. So you go to the little F thing there, and you click on services, and you basically have to configure some security credentials back here and some things to log in. So basically, what you're doing is you're telling the bot to go integrate with some special custom services that allow it to talk to a back end. That's what the purpose is. It's basically you're defining a connection. And so, for the sake of the workshop here, we've given you a file to copy some credentials into that that form. So the first thing you want to do is copy in the back end ID. So you cut and paste that from this little file that I have here open on the right, or on the left, sorry. And then you cut and paste the metadata URL. And then lastly, you use an anonymous key. So I'll select that here, bring that up. It should work, hopefully. And it should work. So let me know if any of you have had problems with this, and then I'll make sure that you have the right credentials. You should work. Yeah, sure.
So in the part where we are what's on the credit card, getting the balances, tracking spending,
Right.
all of the possible events.
Mm-hmm.
So I get what this is doing here. It's very clever. So I went through and I tracking spending, an example, added it on Ukraine, Iran, and when I typed what's on the credit card, I get tracking spending. When I type what's on my credit card, I get balances. What happened there?
So it sounds like you went down one dialog path versus another. And the reason for that is that the intent classifier felt that that was the right thing to do. So the reason for that is probably, and I need to actually go look at what you actually did, is that maybe the training set didn't actually tell it to go the route that you would want it to go. I don't know why, because I've got to go take a look at it.
So what is, so the difference in what is and what's?
No, I said, here we go. Got track spending. What's on the credit card, right? I switched to just kind of second grade. Like I said, the first one is very explicit. There's a second one is much more accommodating variations. Sorry, run again.